I am delighted today to have Jean Marie Barch with us to facilitate a discussion on ageism. And we had a really good illustration this morning of how ageism not only occurs between generations, what young people think about older adults, and what older adults think about younger people, but it's often something we've taken in and believe about ourselves. And I think that ageism is kind of the last frontier. Like, we know it's not okay to say racist things or sexist things. Why is it still okay to say ageist things? So I'm delighted, and I will encourage Jean Marie to speak out of their silence. Good afternoon, friends, and welcome.
Good afternoon.
I'm smiling in part because I, as you saw, picked up my iPad as soon as I stood, in the effort to make it look as if I was extraordinarily well prepared and was going to read to you from what I had carefully written. What I've learned over the years is that I can prepare as much as I want, and I can write as much as I want, and it can be as articulate and appropriate as possible, and that may or may not be what I'm given to say. So I will start out by saying to you that if there comes a point when I stop in mid-sentence and look as though I have no idea what I'm going to say next, that's probably true. And what I ask of you is that you simply hold me in prayer, because it means that something that I wasn't expecting is on the way, and I just have to wait for it. So I ask your indulgence and your understanding in that, and your participation in keeping me on track. It seemed appropriate to me to start by giving you a little bit of a flavor of, first of all, where I come from around the idea of ageism, and what it is that I think that's about. Susan did a wonderful job of preluding that for me by saying that ageism isn't necessarily the same thing as oldism. We suffer a great deal in this country from assumptions about people who are older than, pick your favorite age. One of my fond memories was of going to a college reunion where the reunion class ahead of me was wearing a t-shirt that said, "Never trust anyone over 30, crossed out. 40, crossed out. 50, crossed out." And indeed, it indicates and reminds us that old is older than we are, however old we may be. I was very fortunate as a kid to have a great auntie who chose her genes very well, and who was a very, very vital 80-something-year-old when I was a teenager. I remember watching TV one day, and she came to watch with me. And I was on the floor doing leg lifts, because that's, what a preteen does when they're watching TV. And she came, and she sort of looked at me, she said, "Oh, that looks like fun." And this 80-something-year-old woman plunked down on the floor next to me and started doing leg lifts. I didn't think it was quite as extraordinary at the time as I did 10 or 15 years later, when I realized that that wasn't necessarily what 85-year-old women thought they should be doing, but seemed entirely reasonable to her. So that's one snapshot that I have in my mind of what it means to be more years on the earth rather than fewer. And I think that that way of looking at it is a very good reminder, a part of how we frame the idea of age. In some cultures, 40 is much older than 60 is in some other cultures. In some cultures, you're just getting to be sort of kind of grown up in your 70s or 80s, perhaps. And I certainly recall very clearly when my 23-year-old son said to me, So I suppose I don't have the same kind of excuses for bad behavior anymore since my frontal lobes have finally come online. I allowed as how that was true. But we don't necessarily wait to think about somebody to be in their 20s before we think about them as being a grown-up, right? So there are pieces that go into this business of what aging is about. One of them has to do with our biology. We are aging from instant one, friends. It's not that aging catches up with us at 40 or 60 or 80. We're aging from the moment we begin, and all living organisms are. And sometimes that's a really good thing, okay? Because the kind of accumulation of understanding that can come with more years on the earth, if we're paying attention, is really very useful and can be used in very positive ways. In the United States, we tend to think about aging as being something to avoid, which is sort of odd because as far as we know, the alternative to aging is dying. And most of us want to avoid dying. So we've caught ourselves in this odd conundrum and assumed that neither direction in which we must go by virtue of our biology is positive. How very odd. And how very much something to think about in terms of what makes sense for us as we look at issues around oldism. Certainly another piece has to do with our attitude. I talked about my great auntie, who clearly didn't believe there was anything she couldn't do. It just never occurred to her. She was perfectly able to do whatever she chose. And that was true until she was 99, 363 days, at which point she had a stroke. But she was doing just fine until then. So her attitude toward what was within the realm of the possible changed what was within the realm of the possible for her. That's true for all of us. If you approach something with the idea of, oh, this is going to be hard, it will be. If you approach it with, I'm going to give this my best shot, we'll see what happens. Okay, that's a different kind of way of going into it. So it is with aging. Since we don't have a choice about doing it, we might as well give it our very, very best shot and bring with it as much vitality as we can. I say that and hesitate because as we can is really important. I don't know about any of you, but I know for myself, my best on day X and my best on day Y are not going to be the same. That's not because I'm aging, it's because I'm human. And it's easy to forget that because it's true for us at every age. Ashton will talk about the fact that she used to talk about how her bad knee was because she was getting old, until she remembered that her other knee was the same age and it didn't bother her. I think that's a really important recognition. Some of you may notice I limp, and I have since I was 16 when I had a knee injury. And people are always saying to me, oh yes, it's so hard when you get old, you know. I'm like, well, actually I walk better now than I did 5 years ago, and I'm 5 years older, but you know. So that context becomes a crucial one for us to carry. And to remember that we can either talk ourselves into things not going well, or we can do the best we can and see what that turns out to be. So attitude is an important piece. And the belief system and context within which we culturally live is important as well. A college professor of mine finally decided to retire in her late 70s. And her daughter decided that she really ought to move into a facility where she could be taken care of. And after a lot of very, very hard pressure from her daughter, she did indeed move in to a lovely place. Her first act, and I think by that time she was well into her 80s, her first act was to do voter registration because she discovered that too many of these people had not changed their registration when they moved, and this was anathema to her, and so she carefully organized the entire nursing home and got people to register to vote, and then convinced the facility that they should bus people to the polls so that they could vote. 2 years later, she said, you know, I can't stay here. There are too many old people. She did. She moved back in by herself for about 5 years, and then finally her daughter said, no, really, I can't stand it any longer. I'm too worried. You have to move. But I share that, again, because her understanding of herself had nothing to do with the number of years she'd been on Earth. It had a great deal to do with the ways in which she was still vitally interested in being a part of her world, and in being as influential as she was able to be. That's not about age, friends. That can be true of the 6-year-old or the 66-year-old or older, or sometimes even younger. I know for myself, some of the most powerful eldering I've ever gotten was from somebody who was at the time about 45 or 50 years my junior. Because that person was grounded in spirit in a way that allowed them to be available. I know 66-year-olds who aren't necessarily always that grounded. So I ask us to enter into a willing suspension of disbelief as we listen to what Ashton has to share with us around ageism, and as we begin to reflect on what that means for us. In order to prepare us to watch, I'm going to ask you to just really settle deep for a moment. And I'm going to ask you to cast your mind back through your life. However old you are now, I want you to dial back year by year. And I want you to think about what's the age that's most you? Were you most you yesterday? 5 years ago? 10? 20? 30? 40? 50? 60? 70? 80 years ago? It's important, friends, to locate ourselves in ourselves. There are many who would say, oh, gee, I want to be X again, 16, 26, 40, whatever it is. But I ask you to reflect and just to hold that understanding of where across your lifespan up to now are you most you? And we'll talk a little bit after about what that means. So, let's watch.
What's one thing that every person in this room is going to become? Older. And most of us are scared stiff at the prospect. How does that word make you feel? I used to feel the same way. What was I most worried about? Ending up drooling in some grim institutional hallway. And then I learned that only 4% of older Americans are living in nursing homes, and the percentage is dropping. What else was I worried about? Dementia. Turns out that most of us can think just fine to the end. Dementia rates are dropping too. The real epidemic is anxiety over memory loss. I also figured that old people were depressed because they were old and they were going to die soon. It turns out that the longer people live, the less they fear dying, and that people are happiest at the beginnings and the ends of their lives. It's called the U-curve of happiness, and it's been borne out by dozens of studies around the world. You don't have to be a Buddhist or a billionaire. The curve is a function of the way aging itself affects the brain. So I started feeling a lot better about getting older, and I started obsessing about why so few people know these things. The reason is ageism, discrimination and stereotyping on the basis of age. We experience it anytime someone assumes we're too old for something, instead of finding out who we are and what we're capable of, or too young. Ageism cuts both ways. All isms are socially constructed ideas: racism, sexism, homophobia, and that means we make them up, and they can change over time. All these prejudices pit us against each other to maintain the status quo, like auto workers in the US competing against auto workers in Mexico instead of organizing for better wages. We know it's not okay to allocate resources by race or by sex. Why should it be okay to weigh the needs of the young against the old? All prejudice relies on othering, seeing a group of people as other than ourselves, other race, other religion, other nationality. The strange thing about ageism, that other is us. Ageism feeds on denial, our reluctance to acknowledge that we are going to become that older person. It's denial when we try to pass for younger, or when we believe in anti-aging products, or when we feel like our bodies are betraying us simply because they are changing. Why on earth do we stop celebrating the ability to adapt and grow as we move through life? Why should aging well mean struggling to look and move like younger versions of ourselves? It's embarrassing to be called out as older until we quit being embarrassed about it. And it's not healthy to go through life dreading our futures. The sooner we get off this hamster wheel of age denial, the better off we are. Stereotypes are always a mistake, of course, but especially when it comes to age, because the longer we live, the more different from one another we become, right? Think about it. And yet, we tend to think of everyone in a retirement home as the same age, old. When they can span 4 decades, can you imagine thinking that way about a group of people between the ages of 20 and 60? When you get to a party, do you head for people your own age? Have you ever grumbled about entitled millennials? Have you ever rejected a haircut or a relationship or an outing because it's not age appropriate? For adults, there's no such thing. All these behaviors are ageist. We all do them, and we can't challenge bias unless we're aware of it. Nobody's born ageist, but it starts in early childhood, around the same time attitudes towards race and gender start to form, because negative messages about late life bombard us from the media and popular culture at every turn. Right? Wrinkles are ugly. Old people are pathetic. It's sad to be old. Look at Hollywood. A survey of recent Best Picture nominations found that only 12% of speaking or named characters were age 60 and up, and many of them were portrayed as impaired. Older people can be the most ageist of all because we've had a lifetime to internalize these messages, and we've never thought to challenge them. I had to acknowledge it and stop colluding. Senior moment quips, for example. I stopped making them when it dawned on me that when I lost the car keys in high school, I didn't call it a junior moment. Like I stopped blaming my sore knee on being 64. My other knee doesn't hurt, and it's just as old. We are all worried about some aspect of getting older, whether running out of money, getting sick, ending up alone, and those fears are legitimate and real. But what never dawns on most of us is that the experience of reaching old age can be better or worse depending on the culture in which it takes place. It is not having a vagina that makes life harder for women, it's sexism. It's not loving a man that makes life harder for gay guys, it's homophobia. And it is not the passage of time that makes getting older so much harder than it has to be, it is ageism. When labels are hard to read, or there's no handrail, or we can't open the damn jar, we blame ourselves, our failure to age successfully, instead of the ageism that makes those natural transitions shameful and the discrimination that makes those barriers acceptable. You can't make money off satisfaction, but shame and fear create markets, and capitalism always needs new markets. Who says wrinkles are ugly? The multi-billion-dollar skincare industry. Who says perimenopause and low T and mild cognitive impairment are medical conditions? The trillion-dollar pharmaceutical industry. The more clearly we see these forces at work, the easier it is to come up with alternative, more positive, and more accurate narratives. Aging is not a problem to be fixed or a disease to be cured. It is a natural, powerful, lifelong process that unites us all. Changing the culture is a tall order, I know that, but culture is fluid. Look at how much the position of women has changed in my lifetime, or the incredible strides that the gay rights movement has made in just a few decades, right? Look at gender. We used to think of it as a binary, male or female, and now we understand it's a spectrum. It is high time to ditch the old-young binary too. There is no line in the sand between old and young after which it's all downhill. And the longer we wait to challenge that idea, the more damage it does to ourselves and our place in the world. Like in the workforce, where age discrimination is rampant. In Silicon Valley, engineers are getting Botox and hair plugged before key interviews. And these are skilled white men in their 30s, so imagine the effects further down the food chain. The personal and economic consequences are devastating. Not one stereotype about older workers holds up under scrutiny. Companies aren't adaptable and creative because their employees are young. They're adaptable and creative despite it. Companies... We know that diverse companies aren't just better places to work, they work better. And just like race and sex, age is a criterion for diversity. A growing body of fascinating research shows that attitudes towards aging affect how our minds and bodies function at the cellular level. When we talk to older people like this, or call them sweetie or young lady, it's called elder speak, they appear to instantly age, walking and talking less competently. People with more positive feelings towards aging walk faster, they do better on memory tests, they heal quicker, and they live longer. Even with brains full of plaques and tangles, some people stayed sharp to the end. What did they have in common? A sense of purpose. And what's the biggest obstacle to having a sense of purpose in late life? A culture that tells us that getting older means shuffling off stage. That's why the World Health Organization is developing a global anti-ageism initiative to extend not just lifespan, but health span. Women experience the double whammy of ageism and sexism, so we experience aging differently. There's a double standard at work here, shocker. The notion that aging enhances men and devalues women. Women reinforce this double standard when we compete to stay young. Another punishing and losing proposition. Does any woman in this room really believe that she is a lesser version, less interesting, less fun in bed, less valuable than the woman she once was? This discrimination affects our health, our well-being, and our income. And the effects add up over time. They are further compounded by race and by class, which is why everywhere in the world, the poorest of the poor are old women of color. What's the takeaway from that map? By 2050, 1 out of 5 of us, almost 2 billion people, will be age 60 and up. Longevity is a fundamental hallmark of human progress. All these older people represent a vast, unprecedented, and untapped market. And yet, capitalism and urbanization have propelled age bias into every corner of the globe, from Switzerland, where elders fare the best, to Afghanistan, which sits at the bottom of the global Age Watch Index. Half of the world's countries aren't mentioned on that list because we don't bother to collect data on almost 2 million people because they're no longer young. Almost 2/3 of people over 60 around the world say they have trouble accessing health care. Almost 3/4 say their income doesn't cover basic services like food, water, electricity, and decent housing. Is this the world we want our children, who may well live to be 100, to inherit? Everyone, all ages, all genders, all nationalities, is old or future old. And unless we put an end to it, ageism will oppress us all. And that makes it a perfect target for collective advocacy. Why add another ism to the list when so many, racism in particular, call out for action? Here's the thing. We don't have to choose. When we make the world a better place to grow old in, we make it a better place in which to be from somewhere else, to have a disability, to be queer, to be non-rich, to be non-white. And when we show up at all ages for whatever cause matters most to us, save the whales, save the democracy, we not only make that effort more effective, we dismantle ageism in the process. Longevity is here to stay. A movement to end ageism is underway. I'm in it, and I hope you will join me.